오는 길에 좀 쌀쌀해서 걸쳤어요.
이거 가셔도 되는데 감사합니다. 네.
여자는 보내줘.
아이씨.
오래간만에 회포나 볼까?
위험해. 이거 조심히
연기 안
어울리네. 이거 혜씨를 꼬시나 오세요. 혜씨. 이제 꼬시나.
총을 넣어.
혜씨.
뭐는 거지?
In 2025, Korea's latest crime blockbuster Comic Badass 2 finally hit theaters with a bang, starring none other than national heartthrob Kwon Sang-woo. As a highly anticipated sequel, the film sparked wildly divided opinions after release. Still, its wildly original plot twists and drop-dead gorgeous cast left countless viewers pleasantly stunned. But the real curveball? No one expected Korea's directors to double down on their shamelessly over-the-top, fantasy-fueled style of storytelling. The story begins with Bong Joon, a seemingly ordinary comic book artist, but only a handful of people know he was once a high-ranking agent with the National Intelligence Service. To chase his dream, he walked away from the spy game, but when his debut comic skyrockets to fame, fans start connecting the dots because, suspiciously, Bong Joon looks exactly like his fictional main character. Sensing things spiraling out of control, Bong Joon scrambles to play the poor, clueless artist on camera, flat out denying every conspiracy theory flooding the internet. What he doesn't know is that this very public lie enrages his old enemies, and one by one, they begin smuggling themselves into Korea, hell-bent on revenge. Luckily, Bong Joon's former team leader and his overzealous fanboy Cheol saw this coming. Every time, they arrived ahead of the assassins, taking them all down before a single move could be made. But they never told Bong Joon, not because they didn't care but because they did. Now that Bong Joon has built a happy family, they've chosen to protect him from the shadows without ever letting him know. Meanwhile, his wife Mina finally hosts her dream art exhibition, thanks in part to Bong Joon's support. Of course, NIS salaries are laughably low, so the team leader shows up with 2 mega packs of tissues as a gift. Cheol, not wanting to be outdone, brings the exact same thing. Their congratulations? Let's just say, it was the thought that counted. During Deokkyu's visit to the gallery, Mina introduced him to her business partner Haein. The moment Deokkyu saw Haein's beauty, his heart didn't just skip a beat, it completely surrendered. When Haein asked about his job, Deokyu coolly lied that he was a college professor, cracking a few jokes to ease the awkward tension. Once she learned he was still single, Haein couldn't help but feel a spark of interest. To drop a not-so-subtle hint before leaving, Haein tossed him a flirtatious wink, instantly making Deokyu feel like spring had arrived in his heart. What he didn't know was that Haein then turned right around and made a move on Cheol. The moment Cheol saw her those looks that charm his heart nearly exploded.
저기요?
사랑해요.
이러지 않으셔도 되는데.
And when she handed him her business card, Cheol stood there grinning like a fool, unable to believe what was happening right in front of him. Little did he know, Deokyu was off to the side feeling the exact same kind of joy. From that moment on, Haein began sending them both flirty texts during work breaks and even made time for one-on-one dates with each of them. Cheol caught on pretty quickly, but after finally meeting a woman who looked like a goddess, there was no way he'd back down for Deokyu. And of course, Deokyu felt exactly the same. What neither of them realized is that the prettier the woman, the deadlier the danger. Meanwhile, Bong Joon had just wrapped up his second comic, but to his shock, once the editor posted it online, readers tore it to shreds, calling the plot a total disaster and accusing him of setting the bar way too high. To make things worse, even his daughter chimed in, saying the story was boring and flat. The backlash was brutal. The editor was so overwhelmed he practically wanted to crawl into a hole and die. Desperate to cut the losses, he begged Bong Joon to halt the comic immediately and go home to start a brand new story from scratch. But Bong Joon wasn't ready to give up just yet. He first asked to collect his payment. It wasn't just that he was flat broke, the real kicker was that he'd stupidly followed the editor's hot theme stock tip. And now, he'd lost everything. If Mina ever found out he'd mortgaged the house, he might not live to see the next sunrise. But then the editor turned the tables, breaking down in tears and claiming he too had lost every last cent. If his wife found out, she'd be on the rooftop ready to jump. Realizing they were both in the same sinking boat, Bong Joon sighed and knew he'd have to find another way out. After mulling it over, he refused to cave to the trolls online. He was convinced his comeback had to come from his comics, a true underdog revival. Soon enough, inspiration struck again. This time, to avoid another public firestorm, Bong Joon aimed his story at private corporations, with a plot centered on stealing AI technology from a major tech giant. He carefully mapped out the plan. The thieves would first launch a smoke grenade, creating a fake fire and triggering an emergency evacuation. When ambulances arrived, the criminals disguised as medics would slip into the building unnoticed, locate the database, copy the tech, and rig explosives on their way out. Only then would the protagonist show up. Realizing he was too late, perfect setup for the next chapter. When the editor heard the new pitch, he lit up and shouted, "Now that's a real comic!" and rushed Bong Joon back home to get drawn. After an all-night grind, the comic dropped and readers went wild. The same haters from before instantly flipped into die-hard fans, and Bong Joon finally saw a glimmer of hope. But just as life started looking up, one uninvited guest came crashing in and shattered his peace. Through a connection set up by Haein, an art collector named Cheo Ryong agreed to display some rare works at Mina's gallery. What Mina didn't know was that Cheo Ryong wasn't a collector at all, he was a ruthless terrorist. That very night, Cheo Ryong happened to stumble upon Bong Joon's latest comic, and with one glance, a twisted idea was born. Wasting no time, he and his men set out into the night, painstakingly recreating every detail of the comic's heist, step by step. What Cheo Ryong didn't expect was that Bong Joon's fantasy would work that perfectly. With a thunderous explosion lighting up the night sky, the incident shot to the top of every trending search. Bong Joon instantly became public enemy number one, slammed by the media for jeopardizing national security. When the NIS director caught wind of it, he lost his mind, roaring like a wild beast and ordering DIQ to bring Bong Joon in immediately. Meanwhile, Bong Joon was still fast asleep until Mina shook him awake. Groggy and confused, he had no idea he was now at the center of a nationwide manhunt, and before he could make sense of what was happening, the agents arrived at his door. As Bong Joon's rock, Mina never doubted his character. She firmly insisted that there was no way her husband could be behind the attack. But the NIS director didn't hold back, he dropped a bombshell. According to classified intel, Bong Joon had secretly mortgaged their home to invest in stocks, all without telling Mina. And now, he'd lost everything, right down to his underwear. Mina was stunned. In a flash, the interrogation room turned into a full-blown domestic disaster zone. Watching the chaos unfold, the director figured why not stir the pot even more? So he dropped an even bigger bombshell. Before she met Bong Joon, Mina was the undisputed queen of the club scene, famous for seducing any man in under 60 seconds. Facing her own ultimate cringe moment, Mina looked like she wanted to sink into the floor or claw out a one-bedroom apartment just to hide in.
미나야, 너 대체 누구야? 난 너 잘 모르겠다. 낯설어.
아유, 정말 아유, 야, 그래 나 좀 놀아 더라고. 어? 지금 물리냐? 물려? 그럼 물려?
아니.
스크립트.
But what no one realized was that they'd still underestimated Mina. After storming out in a fury, Mina left Bong Joon to clean up the mess. Finally given a chance to speak, Bong Joon poured his heart out. After hearing his statement, the NIS chief was convinced Bong Joon wasn't the mastermind behind the attack. Still, someone had to figure out who was, and that someone was Bong Joon. At the detention center, he soon discovered that the three enemies who'd snuck into Korea had been targeting him all along. When he learned that DIQ and Cheol had been secretly protecting him this whole time, Bong Joon was overwhelmed with gratitude. The three pledged to be ride-or-die brothers for life. After going through all the case files, Bong Joon still couldn't make sense of it. The intel from NIS wasn't enough, so he decided, if the enemy loves copying his comics, then he'd use that against them by baiting them into action through a new storyline, a little comic book catfishing. After weighing the risks, Bong Joon chose to set the next comics crime scene in a bank. Not only would it feel fresh, but it'd increase the chances of luring the real mastermind out of hiding. But after he posted the comic online, the NIS chief officially banned Bong Joon and his friends from joining the mission, citing safety concerns. In reality, the guy just wanted all the glory for himself. So DIQ and Cheol were benched at NIS headquarters, while Bong Joon, the main target, was isolated in a safe house, waiting on standby. But no one saw what was coming next. As DIQ and Cheol sat around, bored out of their minds, they suddenly got a text from Haein. She wanted to meet up for a date. Even though they knew there was an operation underway, both men were hopelessly love-struck. They grabbed flowers and rushed off to the gallery. The moment they saw their goddess Haein again, they turned right back into simping fools. But just as they were bickering for her attention, a group of armed terrorists burst onto the scene. And then, Cheo Ryong stepped out of the shadows. DIQ froze. He clearly recognized the man and instantly knew something was very, very wrong. Sensing danger, DIQ told Haein to run, a gallant move. But Haein suddenly snatched a gun, then, to their utter shock, threw herself into Cheo Ryong's arms and began making out with him, passionately and without shame. It was only then that the two finally realized Heian was in on it. And just like that, they were crushed. Xiaoryan tied them up and brought them back to his base. Xiaoryan dropped the pretense and got straight to the point. Where's the weapon from the gates of hell? That one question told Diakyu everything he needed to know. The Hellgate wasn't just a name, it was a portable nuclear bomb, developed by North Korea using old Soviet tech years ago. At the time, Intel revealed the weapon was meant to be used in an operation to overthrow the South Korean government. To stop the plan, the NIS secretly sent Bong Joon deep into the north. Against all odds, he infiltrated the facility and stole the nuke. But what no one predicted was that North-South relations would soon begin to thaw. Still, despite the diplomatic shift, North Korea launched a brutal purge in retaliation for the stolen weapon, dragging anyone remotely connected into the wilderness to be eliminated. Xiaoryan's family was among those executed. Though Bong Joon carried heavy guilt, the fallout had been impossible to foresee, and now Xiaoryan was standing here very much alive. That meant he'd survived the purge, and had been plotting his revenge ever since. Steal the nuke back from the NIS and unleash destruction on South Korea. But Diakyu, knowing how dangerous this man was, refused to give up the weapon's location. Then came the real betrayal. Heian stepped forward and revealed she knew where it was. During a drunken date with Diakyu, she'd coaxed the information out of him.
싱싱 같은 새끼야. 아이, 조그만 새끼야. 응?
이제 시작하자.
Xiaoryan wasted no time, since most of the National Intelligence Agency agents were still camped out at the bank pursuing false leads. He easily broke through the defenses. Luckily, Diakyu had just enough time to trigger Siri and call Bong Joon, warning him to stop them. Just as Bong Joon reeled from the shock, a second blow hit him. His webtoon had just updated. Turns out, Xiaoryan had already sent men to the publishing office and taken the editor hostage. The latest chapter? He twisted the story to paint the protagonist Bong Joon as a terrorist plotting to nuke Seoul into a firestorm. The post exploded online. In minutes, the entire country was in panic mode. Thankfully, Bong Joon called Mina. Still believing in her husband, she followed his instructions and raced to rescue Diakyu. It was finally Mina's moment to shine.
한잔 어때요?
얘 미쳤나 이걸? 어둠에서 술 처먹고 와서리?
She managed to free both men just in time. Meanwhile, Bong Joon arrived at the storage site, but Xiaoryan had already snatched the nuke. Seeing Bong Joon on the surveillance feed, Xiaoryan panicked. Not willing to let his revenge fail, he released Bong Joon's 3 sworn enemies as a distraction and fled with the bomb. But he underestimated Bong Joon's skills. In a brutal hand-to-hand showdown, Bong Joon took all 3 enemies down without breaking stride. He raced to the rooftop only to find that Xiaoryan had already activated the detonator. Knowing escape was his next move, Bong Joon shot down the helicopter pilot and shouted, "If you've got guts, face me one-on-one." But Xiaoryan wasn't stupid. He opened fire relentlessly, forcing Bong Joon to duck for cover.
족수가 안 맞더라, 이 비겁한 새끼들아!
대장.
Once his ammo ran dry, Sheol and Diakyu finally caught up. Now it was a fair fight and the trio was more than ready. With fists flying and bodies crashing, Sheol quickly overwhelmed his opponent. Diakyu also had the upper hand until he saw Heian about to fall off the roof. Against his better judgment, he saved her. And how did she thank him? By stabbing him in the thigh. Seeing Diakyu in mortal danger, Sheol kicked the enemy to the ground without hesitation. Now it was time for the final showdown, Bong Joon vs. Xiaoryan.
지옥문 멈춰! 왜 겁나는 게야?
But just as Bong Joon was about to stop the bomb from exploding, Xiaolong shot the control panel, destroying any chance of disarming the bomb. With no way to deactivate the device, there was only one solution: fly at 3,000 meters above the ocean and detonated mid-air to avoid civilian casualties. Sheol and Diakyu both refused to let Bong Joon take the risk. So, with a heavy heart, Bong Joon knocked them both out one punch each and boarded the helicopter with the bomb. Those few minutes felt like a lifetime. From the cockpit, Bong-joon called Mina for what he thought would be his final goodbye, pouring his heart out in a tearful, last message of love. Moments later, the helicopter exploded in the sky. But just then, Deokkyu's phone rang. It was Bong-joon. He'd survived. Right before detonation, he'd tied his shoelaces around the helicopter controls, setting it to autopilot and leapt out mid-flight, diving into the ocean below. The team rushed to the coast, and there, dragging himself out of the waves, was Bong-joon, alive and reunited with his wife and daughter in a tearful embrace. Watching the touching scene, Deokyu and Cheol began to dream about their own futures, but after getting burned by love once, they'd lost all faith in women, or so they claimed, because the second they spotted a beautiful female rescue worker, they were instantly head over heels again, racing to be the first to flirt.
나 결혼하고 싶어졌어. 나 떨고 있네. 이번만 장보해라.
사랑해요.